Hi, I'm Elizabeth Cornwell.
And I'm Rob Penzak. Welcome to Road to Reason. Over the last month or so, we've developed something of a theme here. Started off talking with Sean Faircloth with the ongoing attack of the theocrats and discussing how religion and really some small religious groups have tried to exert a lot of power over where our whole American culture is going. This isn't just about a few religious people, but really why the religious right is taking over and directing us where a lot of people don't want to go. After that, we had a show talking about the National Day of Prayer. And it's important that we distinguish, this is once again a right-wing religious group that's not trying to assure that everybody has the right to pray, which they already do, wherever they want, whenever they want, to whomever they want, and that's how it's been, since the Constitution, the First Amendment. So again, this is the National Day of Prayer. It's really about getting one specific group, getting the government seal of approval on the prayers that they're going to want issued. The week after that, we talked about the harm that religion causes, starting off in antiquity with Socrates being killed because he didn't worship the appropriate state gods. Then moving on to talk about the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the witch hunts. Moving forward in time to the Bible's warm embrace of slavery, that peculiar institution as it was called. And then moving to present day time, where we can see that religion continues to denigrate science and rational thought, promote misogyny, homophobia, and other kinds of bigotry. The week after that, last week, we had two guests on. One was Catherine Dunphy, who spoke about the Clergy Project and her association with that, which is something that the Dawkins Foundation and Elizabeth here, I think, helped to get started. And that tries to help people that were religious leaders that no longer believe in some of the very inhumane dogma that they used to preach. They don't believe in this anymore, and they're trying to find ways to extricate themselves from that lifestyle. And we ended up with Rob Boston, who did a very good summary of that whole month by talking about how the religious right really has it wrong with the matter of separation of church and state. And we discussed how it's not just the atheists and the secular community that needs that wall of separation that Madison and Jefferson and our other founders helped put up, but it really protects all the different sects in America, because atheists aren't really the big threat to religions in a sense. The Catholics and the Protestants were never particularly nice to each other when we had the mini theocracies that the colonies started as. So that wall separating between church and state really protects all of the minority religions, which include the Catholics, the Protestants, the Jews, the Buddhists, Muslims, and everybody here in America. So what we're going to do today, in the light of all of that religious damage, is bring in the big God slayer of evolution. And that's why we're very fortunate to have with us our own resident evolutionary psychologist, who's going to explain why people sometimes think and behave in very maladaptive ways. Elizabeth?
Sometimes I like to say it's amazing that humans do as well as they do, as complex as we are in terms of our brains. And as a physician, you have some understanding of that. Brain injuries give us a pretty good window into just how complex the human brain is. And maladaptive behaviors, those can also be, depending on our perspective. Obviously, you and I are sort of on the take of religion being a maladaptive behavior. But one of the things that a biological perspective tries to address is when we look at certain behaviors that may appear to be maladaptive within the social context, within a family context, or for the individual, him or herself, is trying to understand, is there something about that behavior that may have been or could have been adaptive, and that it's that extremeness of it that starts becoming maladaptive? One example of this, and this is one I often use to introduce my students when I was teaching human sexuality from an evolutionary perspective, which is a great way of introducing evolution to young college students, especially in an area like Colorado Springs with such a heavy influence of religion and fundamental religion. Introduce sex and they're sort of interested. They're interested immediately. Help me find a date. But one of the things I start with is that's very maladaptive is we see a great deal of obesity in this country. And it's a problem that is being addressed by, Michelle Obama, for goodness sake, talking about the obesity that has been growing in children. And one aspect of that obesity that we can look at from a biological perspective is what humans like to eat. We're a primate. We're just a hairless ape. Primates like sweet things. And the reason for that is because fruit, when it has its greatest nutrient, it produces a sweet type. It produces something that tastes sweet.
Or tastes good to us. I mean,
Well,
I think that's another thing.
It starts becoming, it starts becoming kind of complex. Sweetness, it produces something that then is interpreted by the tongue, by the brain as being sweet. Primates need that high energy. Fat, incredibly important for our brains. Incredibly important for brain growth in fetus development as well, especially in young infants. We need fat, and fat also helps us sustain during times of deprivation. And then salt. Well, we know that salt is incredibly important for survival. We would not survive without, for very, very long at all, without salt in our system. We would just simply stop functioning if somehow all the salt from our body was drained. We would die. We can't live without salt. And as we know, Romans actually used salt to trade. It was that vital of a substance. So these three items, salt, fat, and sweet, are cravings that kept our species, and long before the hominids arose, kept primates going. And we know that, and fats include things like nuts and so on, but we also see in chimpanzees a need for meat. So this driving need of these three very basic substances for human survival, and we'll just talk about humans now. In our evolutionary environment in which we adapted these things, there were no vending machines, there were no McDonald's, there were no grocery stores, there was no easy access to food. We did not sit behind a desk and work. And in fact, it is sort of, if you think about it, one of our ancestors from several thousand years ago, who had to struggle every day and to find food, perhaps, or it was not an easy existence. And
right.
here,
I think it's important also, like you point out, that this is our evolutionary adaptive period. It's not right now.
It's not right now.
We might have a lot of things that seem like they're maladaptations, but back when we were trying
back
to survive
then,
as a species,
so
they're the only thing
that
got us through.
desire now is not it isn't a maladaptation. It is that need because we need it. Now we're at a point where those of us who want to try to stay fit, we go to a gym or ride our bikes or do something. We actually make an effort to do something physical, which is our ancestors would have thought that was insane. Right. No, when you don't have to work, rest. And then, with vending machines and McDonald's and so on, we have this ready access. And of course, what do we crave? I mean, look at Big Mac meal, right? It's a hamburger with lots of nice juicy fat. It's we've got our French fries with fat and salt, and then we have that good old Coke with lots of sugar in it. It is the ultimate in a package of food. If our ancestors 10,000 years ago could have had access to a Big Mac, they would have been leaping for joy. It's absolutely a perfect combination of food that humans needed. So
it's setting up some kind of political answer to that. So obviously it's hard for us as humans just to say, well, I know this is bad to me, I think I'm going to stop eating it. That works very poorly.
No, it doesn't work.
Does that mean that maybe a political solution and saying companies don't keep putting all this high energy fructose in there, lower your salt levels, does that have any role to play to help the society? Well, that depends on the society. That's not for an evolutionary psychologist or any psychologist to determine. That's a political decision that must be made within the culture and the society itself. Educating people of the awareness of eating the wrong foods and eating too much in general is always good. A colleague of mine who he was part of just completing a study where showing individuals how they could look if they continued to eat in the way they were eating, but over time,
not just a pamphlet describing it, but to actually show some sort of image. One was an image of just somebody random. The other image was they had been manipulated, how they would look after gaining another 40 pounds and how their skin would look and so on. There was a change of behavior.
Did it last? Was that a last?
Well, it was, I mean, the study is continuing, but it lasted over a long enough period to show that that worked rather than just handing them a pamphlet and have them read it and say, no,
So
you
making it
shouldn't
very
eat this.
personal and showing how it's going to relate to them made a big difference as opposed to an academic discussion of this is why you like salt and sugar.
Because people want to look good. People want to be part of, they want to have, they don't want to be marginalized in society.
Maybe we can talk about that a little, if you mind. Why do people want to look good? Why is that just how superficial we are? Or what are the roots of wanting to look good? And then you can talk about how it differs between men and women.
Well, wanting to be attractive to others is important to lots of different species, not just humans. Humans are the only ones that can understand that there is this attractiveness, something that we've labeled as attractive. And the funny thing about attractive is kind of a tricky word, right? If attraction just simply means I want to be with you or you want to be with me, and so when you label something attractive, you can get into this kind of sort of endless loop of what are we really talking about. What some people have looked at, and one of the things I have looked at and I've researched, are there key features to attractiveness? And we've looked at non-human animals as well as human animals. And I'm going to give you an example of a non-human animal. It's a stickleback. And it was kind of a funny little experiment that happened in the way science sometimes, a little bit of luck is a good thing to have. They were studying the mating attraction of sticklebacks, and there was a tank of female sticklebacks and a tank of male sticklebacks. They were kept separate. And male sticklebacks have a bright orange marker on them that the females don't. And the scientists noticed that every day at a particular time, all the females would turn and look out the tank. And finally, he realized that they could see out the window, and it was a bright orange lorry that was stop and park. This was in Britain. Would stop and park. I think it was in Britain, but it was a lorry, bright orange lorry that would stop and park, and all the females were attracted to this bright orange object that they could see. So manipulating the orange in the males helped to define how the females were selecting males to mate with. When we look at humans, it becomes so much more complex because the physical attraction is only one aspect of how we're attracted to another human being. And most people list things such as sense of humor, how do we get along in terms of politics, in terms of what we think about movies and books, and there are all kinds of things that come into play with how humans interact because we are such complex creatures. But in terms of just the physical aspects of what do humans tend to find attractive, and I want to make it clear, we're talking about statistical probabilities, and everyone differs. Independent of race and culture, we find things that are, in terms of males finding females attractive, fairly similar. And that is one, youth, two, having large eyes, and eyes that are closer to the center of the face rather than very, very high on the face. Difference in skin color in terms of the lips and the face itself, and that there's greater distinction between facial coloration and lip coloration, and also the fullness of the lips. Other things are just the shape of the face. There's certain, more a glacial jaw, is considered attractive, more attractive in females.
And are these all just random things, or has science been able to track down why we find these attractive?
We are able to look at what could be the root cause of this attraction, and it has to do with hormones and fertility. Well, youth is an easy one to explain, right? I'm approaching 60, and I'm not going to be having any babies at all, ever. It's done. It's not happening. So right there, just
So
put me
less guys
put me
are going to hit
aside.
on you now because you're not
just
reproductively...
put me to the side. Estrogen, or estrogen as they say here in the States, estrogen is what creates that less, that more neotenous face, is what we call it, a more of a baby face. And that's the big eyes and the full lips. And again, we can go back to the indicators of youth. As we age, all humans men become more feminine looking and women become more masculine. We all kind of regress to the mean. It's what happens as we age. And with women, our eyes become smaller and our lips become less pink, which is why women wear lipstick, and we enhance our eyes. And it's sort of an interesting concept that women have been knowing this for a very long time.
Is this all, or has this historically been, I think until recently, very unconscious, that women weren't necessarily going out to reproduce a reproductively active female by putting on red lipstick or doing whatever with the eyes, yet they did manage to select, these are the things that will be found more attractive and make me more likely to find a mate.
And that's because humans read other people's expressions, and it does become quite complex. I mean, we know the Egyptians used makeup. We know that many cultures use some form of enhancement, tattoos, both males and females. Now, so men are focusing on, just from a biological perspective, what's evolved with them is to look for cues of fertility. It doesn't mean that it's an overriding cue and it's the only cue they look at. No, that's not true. But it is a cue that's there. And from the past, from our ancestral past, those women that had those cues would have had better resources from the men who had those preferences. And men who had preferences for younger women and made a discernment between younger and older women obviously would leave more descendants. Having sexual relationships with a 60-year-old might have been sexually gratifying, but it didn't lead to offspring.
Didn't pass any genes on.
Before
we get on to any new subject, I did my rigorous prep for this show by reading about halfway, so I'll probably get a D, with Psychology, an Evolutionary Approach by Stephen Gowland and Donald McBurney.
Gowland's done some wonderful studies. I've known him for a while.
Okay, so anyway, you can correct me throughout as I make my mistakes, which I will. One of the charts that they have in here is funny. It shows 16 different pencil sketches of a woman with, I guess, different ratios, probably for their face size, their hip to waist, and all these different things. And it says that across all different cultures, men consistently pick, it tells you which letter in which row. And I had looked at it before looking at the caption, and did also pick, well, I guess if I had to pick one. And there's nothing sexy about the drawings. It really specifically must come down to those exact ratios. I thought it was pretty funny that there's 16 very similar images, but whatever that subtle cue is, I certainly picked up on it, and that was...
And again, what I do want to make sure that we don't overemphasize how important this is, because it is only a very slender aspect of how humans find one another attractive. And so let's not go too far into that as saying this is the decision making of how we pick our mate, because it isn't. It isn't. But it is interesting because when you think about how someone might want to market something, why do they use really, really attractive women to sell trucks and cars? What audience are they really directing it to? And these are the things that are interesting. And I'd always ask my students when they would go home at night, you know, when you're watching TV, part of your homework, watch ads, but think about it from the things you've learned in class and how we perceive people, and both male and female, masculine and feminine aspects, and how they're being used in television programs and movies, and how they and advertising. And one example I give is, if you're familiar with the movie Alien with Sigourney Weaver. Now, would Meg Ryan have been a person to put in the role of Sigourney Weaver? Can you see her blowing up aliens and you know, running around and being just one badass mama?
I think I'm not going to answer. I can only get myself in trouble.
But then could you? But I mean, really, it's a sensible question, and it's an okay question to ask, and we shouldn't be afraid of asking those questions. These are the perceptions that we have of somebody. I mean, she's a beautiful woman. She's incredibly handsome, but her facial attributes, wrongly or rightly, we perceive in a particular way. And those things have happened over time and for reasons. I would be willing to bet that at their ages of, say, 21, if they were both 21 and we started doing measures of their hormone levels, we would find Meg Ryan had higher estrogen than Sigourney Weaver, just because of looking at their facial attributes and also their body attributes. And there's nothing to say that this is how we have to make judgments on human beings. There's no judgment to be made. There's nothing to say, oh, you know, we should like these women better than this woman, and that none of that is sensible. It's just simply a fact that is. And one of the things to always remember in any kind of anytime looking at it from a biological perspective of any kind, what is does not necessarily need to be an ought. That we have no control of that. I thought maybe we can jump to the kind of the naturalistic fallacy and talk about how that ties in of, you know, evolutionary psychology. You're not justifying things because you found a pattern in evolution why a lot of men might rape women. You're not saying, hey, this is okay, it's found in nature, it's good. And we talked about this in one other show, how just because something is natural, like cancer, doesn't make it a good thing. Right.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit about, you know, the naturalistic fallacy.
Yeah, the naturalistic fallacy is to assume that if you find something, let's say this desire for having sweets. Let's just use that one for example. Let's talk about something that most people can identify with, this attraction to sweet. The fact that we have this, but it causes obesity, it clearly it is not necessarily good just because we have this desire. People with diabetes also have desire for sweet, and they have to control it in order to survive. So we can take that, yes, we understand why we desire sweets, but we have these tremendously large brains that can override that and say, this is why I don't want to eat chocolate bars for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or I don't want to overexert and eat, you know, a whole bag of Oreos because I'm a little stressed out. This is not good for me. I should reach for an apple. I should make sure I always have fruit around for my children to eat rather than cookies and ice cream and sodas. So those are the kinds of decisions we can make to change of what is to this is how it ought to work. And that's incredibly important to try to understand. And that's what the naturalistic fallacy would try to suggest, is that anytime someone says, here's a root cause for some of these behaviors, such as tribalism, which then translates into racism, or homophobia, or many of the other things that we look at now and say is wrong with humans and what we need to fix. The is just gives us not an excuse, it is just an explanation.
Right, and it can also hopefully, the better we understand why people might be prejudiced, you're not endorsing it, but you might be able to figure out a reason or a way to combat it. Maybe if you do prolonged teaching or prolonged exposure to other people, and why they're not an out group, they can be with you.
And we absolutely know that works. We absolutely know that when people work with people of different races or different sexual orientations, or then that natural tendency for tribalism tends to go away.
I think that's one of the problems maybe with religion, is it artificially creates an in-group and everybody else is the out-group, and it's done since childhood, and then it's very easy for those kids to grow up thinking everybody else is, that guy's a Jew, he's not one of us, or he's a whatever.
Right.
And if you grow up and your friends are Jewish and black and Catholic, everybody's just a mix.
Yeah.
They're just your friends, and I don't think you
because
get that
they're now
artificial
part of your tribe,
barrier.
because you've now recreated an entirely different way of looking at your people. Your people are not defined by their religious beliefs or by the way they look or whether they're in a wheelchair or whether they're old or whether they're young. We define male and female. We define our group as being much more complex than that, and so it becomes much more difficult to create those big walls that throughout human history has existed. And that's why I think Steven Pinker's book is so important, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he shows how we actually have, as a species, reduced violence, reduced the kinds of things like homophobia and racism and attacks, misogyny and things. Doesn't mean that we're perfect yet, or we haven't made it all the way. We may never, I don't know. But yeah, there are certainly things we can learn in terms of the ought and how we get to the ought to happen.
I think that's an important point to make. I don't know if it's in pop psychology where you hear, or just some religious groups, we haven't gotten any better. You take the Bible out, we're just as bad as we've ever been. But to go and look at historically what's actually happened, I don't remember if that was in Guns, Germs, and Steel, but I've read that somewhere else where they kind of go through, we are less violent than we used to be.
Yeah.
I think they talked about how there used to be a lot of cannibalism in old stuff, and a lot of, in human history, and a lot of anthropology would sort of look at some very clear evidence about cannibalism or about warfare, and we wanted to idealize these old cultures and somehow just look past,
the noble savage, noble savage
right.
claim, right?
Yeah, you can see somebody dying with a spear in their hand and say, well, that was an ornamental toothpick, or it wasn't a spear, and it's just absurd the lengths we go to beautify the old stuff. But we have gotten less violent, and there is hope for the future in that sense, and learning can give us a better future.
Yeah, certainly. And on the idea of the noble savage, the whole idea of the noble savage is actually kind of a racist statement in and of itself, that they are somehow very different from the rest of the human race. Helen Fisher, who has written, she's an anthropologist at Rutgers, and she has written many, many books on issues of love and how humans select their partners and the problems that we have when who we select doesn't particularly want to select us back. So very interesting reading. But I asked her once, of all the things that you could change the way anthropology is taught and how we view males and females among men and women and humans, what would it be? And she said her answer was to get rid of the notion that romantic love was only came about with the troubadours. And that, I majored in anthropology as well as psychology in my undergraduate, and that was a common theme in cultural anthropology. If you mentioned romantic love, it was, oh no, that was an invention of the troubadours that has nothing to do with ancient cultures and other cultures, which I stood up in class and said, that is the most racist statement I have ever heard, that you would deny the fact that other races cannot have romantic love, when in fact the earliest writing, besides accounting stuff and government stuff, was a love poem of how much a man missed the woman he was in love with. So from an evolutionary psychological perspective, there was no question that romantic love has been part of human history, and that no one would even suspect that romantic love was something invented by troubadours. It isn't completely inane concept from the perspective of those of us who would look at humans as being a species who evolved not just in body form with opposable thumbs, but our brains evolved as well, and to navigate through the niches that humans ended up traveling, which is a very unique niche. I mean, humans are an incredibly unique species, which makes it fun studying them.
It does. Maybe one thing we can talk about as well is how important it is that people have been, or humans, come from a very social group, and you can maybe set out some differences and similarities between humans and other species. One kind of myth that I heard, reading through this book and have come across elsewhere, is that animals don't do any learning. I know you can talk to us a little about B.F. Skinner, but some of the studies, and I think maybe you have some different views on these are just from reading this, that some animals, like even ants in the desert, that they need to do very complicated forms of learning that old psychology would have denied possible, right? It's that animals have instincts and humans are capable of learning. So the desert ants, if you set them out, they go wandering off in their zigzag direction, and then they can always find their way back. And they thought that's by vector summation. So they do this somewhat complicated math in the sense that they have to be able to track themselves back, and they did scientific experiments that now if you move them by a certain amount, they'll travel back to where they were. And they did experiments to rule out that it was by visual cues and what it was by. And so it was kind of impressive that an insect can have the intellect to actually learn something. I think it's instructive. I know you said, maybe you can tell me the other side of the
I won't use the term
theories.
intellect with ants, right. I'm sorry.
You tell me that, and then I can talk about birds, but so what's the other side of that ant story?
I'm not going to go too much into. I'm not going to go into the ant story, but I'm going to go into something that I think is incredibly important to understand in terms of psychology within the United States and what happened. And there were people that actually did have a sympathy toward kind of a biological explanation of things. It was there, and has been all along, but it has been going along quietly.
But you said that even Darwin, in the very beginning, was aware of the psychological implications.
Oh, Darwin is the father of modern psychology in terms of how we understand. I really do think that Darwin has added a great depth and understanding of human psychology. But Watson and Skinner, the behaviorist, came onto the scene, and in the United States it was widely accepted. Less so in other parts of Europe, and I won't even get into the history of that because that gets it's fun history, but not time for in this program. Skinner and behaviorism basically had the blank slate idea that we are all pretty much empty little boxes that we feed information into, and we reward and we punish, and with the ability to reward and punish, we can mold any behavior, and that's how humans learn. So blank slate is the term that tends to be used for that model.
And we were just like Pavlov's dog, that if you gave us the right stimulus, we would salivate or do the appropriate.
Right. And without any consideration as to the biological background of any species. And for example, without looking at how an animal, a species evolved, you could pick and choose. You could use the same experiment on one species, such as trying to make the superstitious pigeon, which Skinner did by randomizing the reward system, and pigeons would, on this randomization, if they happened to be doing a behavior when the pellet of food came out, they would start repeating that behavior. And eventually they would come up with these bizarre routines that they would continually do, and each one did it differently. And then the pellet would, of course, eventually fall out, and it would reinforce the behavior. But doing that to another species, it may not have worked. Pigeons happen to be very good at, the reward system seemed to work very well with them in this particular instance. In humans, it works really well. That if you go to Las Vegas, you can see how well it works whenever you walk by people who are gambling, or especially those slot machines. You see these particular behaviors that are repeated. Also, we see it in sports people, mostly on team sports, not on individual sports, which is another really interesting aspect of how humans think and perceive and have these kind of magic ways of making things work. It's what causes OCD, is the idea of repeating a behavior to get the right outcome. Now, with humans, repeating a behavior to get the right outcome is not necessarily a bad idea. Again, we go back to what is maladaptive and what isn't. It's not necessarily maladaptive to repeat behaviors in order to get the correct result. An example.
Right, that could be part of learning, it would seem. You learn, you do this, you get that, and so that's...
So flinting, you flint certain ways, and you find a particular way of holding the flint is going to give you a better edge. It's going to, help. So you're going to repeat certain processes, going back to the same quarry where you find and knowing where to look for these things. Those are repeated behaviors. But then it can also go completely wrong, where we end up with severe OCD, where obsessive compulsive behavior, we have people that have to flip a light on and off 42 times, and if they miscount, they have to start completely over. So again, it goes from the adaptive into a maladaptive form, but understanding that the need to redo behaviors and may actually be a very good way of getting things done in certain circumstances.
That's something I found very interesting just in going through this book, is that taking the evolutionary approach to psychology really does give you such a better framework to make sense of stuff. And things that, if you're just doing, I guess, classical Skinnerian, you may have no idea how these two things hang together, but then when you realize, you try to look back, why would the animal behave this way? And you can look at each different animal, how rats were really good at pressing levers, but that has to do with probably how they foraged for food. Mm-hmm. And pigs are good at pushing something around on the ground because they're used to rooting with their snout to discover stuff, but they couldn't push the lever in the same way.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, once you just take that evolutionary mindset, it just let you kind of understand so much more about each animal and about human beings too.
But it doesn't necessarily give you the answer.
It
can help you understand why certain species behave the way they do. It doesn't necessarily mean that we know how to, find a rationale or find a way of fixing something that is broken. For example, OCD. That I don't think that evolutionary psychology, as just a discipline and understanding that we all evolved and that we need, that understanding how we may have developed certain behaviors is important. Evolutionary psychology is not the psychology then to try to understand how do we help somebody who actually does have OCD. Then we start looking at things such as the how the brain works and the chemicals of the brain. Exactly. So evolutionary psychology can do nothing to help us there. And what I hope evolutionary psychology can accomplish is simply act as a way of giving information to other disciplines in order for them to recognize that, oh yes, there could be a biological component here, and maybe we ought to give that at least a look-see to recognize if there's something that it can help us in understanding the problem and maybe finding a solution. But evolutionary psychology needs to understand not to be so arrogant as to think that every time we explain something or we make a guess of what happened in our ancestral past is actually even helpful or correct. So there are balances to be had by both.
I did see that. I was reading a little about pop psychology and came across kind of an article that really tried to dismiss evolutionary psychology almost out of hand, and saying that we don't really know what happened way back when, so it's all conjecture. But on the other hand, if you look at how well evolution as a theory works, it's as close to fact as we can get. And if you sort of accept that we no longer believe in a mind-body separation, the mind is what the brain does in a sense, to to sort of dismiss evolutionary psychology when we know that evolution has built our hearts to pump blood right, our lungs to oxygenate the blood. It's built our brains to meet all the adaptive and reproductive needs of humans. So if the mind is part of the brain, to suddenly try to dismiss evolutionary psychology, it didn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, there are balances to be had for sure, and I do sometimes see that evolutionary psychology and the way it's popularized certainly is not the best way for us to be viewing it. Perhaps there is too much emphasis being placed on sexual differences when, rather than, as I like to look at, which I find the most fascinating, or the similarities that we have. The sex differences are always interesting, and people love to hear about differences. But we can also look at evolutionary psychology to understand how we get along socially and why we have this tribalism and why we are less likely, say, to care for an older adult versus our offspring, and things like parental investment and how many resources we have and how we're related. All of these things start helping us explain why we see patterns in social behavior. And once we can recognize that those patterns exist through an evolutionary lens, then we can start addressing them, not necessarily by using evolutionary psychology to address them, but just by recognizing the pattern. Then we can start using all of the many other disciplines within psychology and within medicine to try to find a resolution for some of these issues.
Maybe we can talk about some misconceptions of evolution, talking not just psychology, but evolution as a whole. Because there's still a lot of people that most people don't believe, or maybe just don't understand enough about evolution to have believed in it yet.
Or even people that accept it.
Yes, true.
I mean, it's not everybody's going to sit down and read on the origin of species, or many of the other books that are written in about the theory of evolution. So it's not just people who don't accept. I think there's a lot of just ignorance on it, and I don't know a lot about quantum mechanics either. So,
and I think evolution is probably particularly important, just because once you grasp it, not that I grasp it all that well, I'm trying to still learn a lot about it, but the better you grasp it, the more likely you are to dismiss some of the things that really run counter to evolution. And that spills through all society and politics and all sorts of stuff. So what about the idea that evolution always fosters what's good for the species? Is that, on a short-term basis, can things still make mistakes, or looking back, they go down the wrong pathway?
Nothing is for the good of the species. And I mean, that's a human perception. And we know this because most species that have ever existed are now extinct. So obviously some things didn't work. And evolution cannot predict the future. We don't evolve for what could happen. We evolve for what happened in our past has given us the genes that we now have to work with as an individual. And if those genes benefit us in the current environment, then we survive and reproduce, then that's good for us as an individual. But there are going to be those individuals, and I'm talking about all species, plants, everything. Those individuals who the genes they inherited are not going to help them through the particular environment that they're facing. Those will not survive or will not reproduce as well as those who have genes either from they've inherited or have had a beneficial mutation that helps them survive the current environment that they can then pass on to their offspring. Right. Now, do those genes then ensure that the offspring will survive? Absolutely not, because the environment may change completely.
Right, and so all the genes can do is sort of try to make, create some children that will then reproduce themselves. And evolution, like you said, it can't look forward is very important. So it can't design this like the godly designer. It will make all sorts of mistakes. And that's one of the very good proofs for evolution is you look at all the places where the wiring of the ureters and the arteries in the area,
Oh.
or the laryngeal nerve, where things, if somebody designed it, they wouldn't do it this way.
They'd be fired. They would have failed their engineering
Right,
degree.
you sort of work
Yeah.
with what you have, and you do your best going forward.
Right, and
with
you
all
can't
the
go
things to do.
back.
And you
That's the
can't,
other
right, and you
thing.
can't undo
There's a
it.
wonderful book
So-
called Kludge. I really recommend it to anybody who is interested in this topic, because it's a fascinating topic of how just messed up we are in how we were built, just design-wise. And it's called Kludge, and I cannot remember the name of the author, but if you look up Kludge in Amazon, it'll come up, and it's a short little book. It's a fun read. I don't know if you've read it.
I have
It's
Jerry Coyne also has Why Evolution is True.
Why
It's another
Evolution is
that
True. I mean,
don't think I've
that's
read the
a
Kludge
little
one.
more dense read. This is just a very simple, and it's funny because it talks about how would you really design the human back. And for someone who has suffered back and neck troubles since I was 16, trust me, reading about how my back should be designed, should have been designed. If there is a God,
Right.
he or she is not done by us very well, because it's a really poor design.
Right, and he or she did poorly on my knees as well. So
Yeah, knees,
both
and
long
all those
sometimes.
things. I mean, we were not designed to be. I mean, we came from a long line of animals that walked on all fours.
Right, not bipeds that are going to try
We
to
are
live to
not
100.
trying to live to 100 and do stupid things like motorcycling and skiing and gymnastics and all the many things that we do to our bodies to break them down, playing football, soccer, all these wonderful things.
And also, I guess the idea of, if you live long enough, that's not necessarily helping your genes. The genes couldn't care that you live to 100.
Oh, yeah, it
Maybe it's
doesn't.
important you live to 40, so you teach your children whatever, so that they are reproductively successful.
Oh,
but
yeah.
at some point, it's irrelevant.
Yeah, pretty much. Do your job, reproduce, get your little genetic packages off to a reproductive age themselves. Maybe in humans, we help with grandchildren, we do alloparenting and things like that. And it gets, again, a little bit more complex with humans and other species as well. There are many species that do alloparenting, and we can look at from birds to other mammals where we see individuals will give up their immediate reproductive success to help raise siblings if times are bad and there's not enough food to go around. So if it was a bad year for, say, finches, happens in finches. They establish where they're going to raise their young. If the following year, when they come back to an area, if it is not a very good year for grasses and seeds and so on, the siblings from the previous nest will not reproduce. Instead, they will help the parents bring in food to their new siblings. If, however, it's a good year and there's plenty of food and opportunity, the first nesting siblings from the previous year will go out and establish their own home site and start raising their own young. So we see these
So it's
kind
ahead. So in good times, they're all going to
Yeah.
try to reproduce, and if not, they'll at least get their, some of the genes by their related brothers and sisters into the next generation.
So we get all these wonderful complications, and that's what I find so fascinating is there isn't just one story, and it goes back to your idea of learning and all these environmental things that come into play that will then have a huge effect on how the behaviors and the genes that manage to survive throughout, as through a long line of individuals that we end up calling a species, that those genes have benefited them, for X amount of time. But it doesn't necessarily mean that in 20 years from now, if we have issues with global warming and we have these other things that are going on, do we actually see that these genes continue to benefit these a particular species? It may or may not. Some species may thrive under global warming, some may not.
It's also important to realize that we're not going to adapt in general that quickly.
Right, we don't
So-
adapt. It's not a matter of adaptation, it's a matter of, do you happen to have the right genes for this particular situation? If you don't,
Right,
there's no adapting.
So anybody that looks to past ice ages or it's true that humans, by and large, may have come about and been so successful from previous bad climate change that other things couldn't handle.
Right.
That's not to say we should project forward and say, hey, we're going to do really well.
Right, exactly.
Right. This is a looming catastrophe that really just scientific ignorance is letting us, plummet toward.
Yeah.
A second misconception about evolution is sometimes because everything is based in genes, it's completely unresponsive to experience. And this goes back to whether or not we're designed with a blank slate. And maybe you can talk about that, how even though things are based in genes, you might not be born with a beard, but it's still programmed into your genes that you're going to develop this.
Right. Genes and environment are fascinating, and the things that we're learning now, and I am certainly not an expert on this, but I have followed some of the, certainly a lot of the work that's gone on in genetics. It's absolutely fascinating. We know that starting in the womb, starting in the womb, we know that the environment of the womb can influence what genes switch on and which don't. It's absolutely fascinating. And it is true that as we age and go through the environment, what genes can be switched on, some genes can be switched on. Celiac is a good example of that. You can have the celiac gene, never experience the actual phenotype of the results of celiac, which is the inability to eat anything with gluten or processed gluten, and it's an autoimmune disease. However, once that gene is switched on, usually because of some sort of stressor, that gene can't be switched back off. So
that can lead to malignancy. I think that's usually in the 20 issues, and can lead to malignancy and all sorts of problems. And so yeah, that's a wonderful thing that we really need to learn about, that kind of interaction.
So environment is incredibly critical in understanding how genes function within an individual. And we know that, say, schizophrenia is another one where there's a strong influence during fetal development of whether or not someone is going to develop schizophrenia later in life. You can have identical twin studies show us that one twin can develop schizophrenia and one cannot, and one won't. Generally, the one that does develop schizophrenia is the one who did not receive as much nutrients in the womb than than the larger, ends up being the larger twin. Studies showing the same thing in Holland when they were occupied by the Nazis. They were reduced to eating tulip bulbs. Excuse me. And then, sure enough, if you look at certain, and don't quote me, but I believe it's the second trimester. It's been a while since I've read this literature, probably 20 some odd years, but I believe it is the second trimester. What they believe happens is that because of the lack of nutrition if it happens during that particular time, either due to flu epidemics or another, we see a big spike in schizophrenia about 15 to 20 years later after large flu epidemics. And but this inability to consume nutrients causes the growth of the brain to pretty much come to a halt. And then when food is reintroduced, when the nutrients rise again, the brain starts to grow, but the correct paths have been lost. And then the results of this don't really express themselves until adolescence. So, there's another excellent example.
It's fascinating to understand too, and that it really could change public health policy, for instance, on how you address flu vaccine, or just general stress. If stress to the mother causes a cortisol spike and that leads to some problems in the baby down the line, we really need to understand those as well as we can to make intelligent decisions, health-wise.
Yeah, and nobody addresses this. I mean, I won't say nobody. Somebody may be addressing this, but you don't hear it much when we talk about the anti-vacciners who, say women who are pregnant shouldn't get a flu vaccine, but they don't even think about what if there is a risk of schizophrenia in the family. Do you really want to advise those women to take that risk and they're pregnant? I mean, we don't fully understand it. These are the kinds of things that, yes, understanding how genes work with the environment is crucial. And so as a physician, let me ask you this. While you were going for medical school, while you were doing medical school, how much did they talk about theory of natural selection and human evolution and how that could be applied in medicine.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long time, and I've practiced for a long time either, but I don't recall getting much of any education. I knew about the theory of evolution, but I don't know how much I learned in medical school, again, as opposed to just my own reading out of interest. And it certainly wasn't incorporated into this is how these diseases came about and any kind of treatment options or things moving forward. It was never integrated in the way it really should be.
And it still isn't. Randy Nesse, who's up at the University of Michigan, and Andy Thompson, whose book you have, Why We Believe in Gods, he's a psychiatrist, so he's an MD as well. And there is great resistance in the medical community of incorporating evolutionary thought. And there's a great book, if you're interested, it's by Randy Nesse and George C. Williams, one of our, the great men of evolutionary theory, and he's now no longer with us, but they wrote a book about medicine and the book unfortunately is called Why We Get Sick. It's a terrible title, but it's about evolution, about looking at medicine from an evolutionary perspective and understanding things as simple as when you get a fever, when do you decide to take that aspirin to reduce your fever?
Right,
because a fever is a natural response to kill the thing that's bad.
Right, that part we learned. I don't remember if it was in the evolutionary context, but absolutely, like by raising your temperature that little bit, that either your enzymes or its enzymes.
So many cultures have sweat houses. They figured it out, right? Mm-hmm. If I'm starting to come down with a cold, going to the sauna for me is a wonderful thing because it's like get that body temperature right, or go for a run. If I can go for a run and work up a sweat before I get really ill, I can often counter that effect. And those are the kinds of things that are so important, and it's lovely. And that's what I mean by when evolutionary theory can help inform these other sciences to look at things from a slightly different perspective. That's the important thing that evolutionary psychology can do, and evolutionary theory can do for these other sciences.
One of the things that they mentioned in this text was that, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but a lot of our evolution was really prodded on by parasites and by pathogens. And I know how the immune system works in response to that, but that it really made a large contribution to everything, and so it really should be deeply integrated with medicine.
No, it is really interesting, and I have met a couple doctors. When I went into, my regular doctor wasn't around. Anyway, but he was just absolutely fascinated. I had a little trilobite on my neck, and we started talking for the next 15 minutes about evolutionary theory and how he was complaining how it's not incorporated into medicine, and it was a lovely conversation. So there are certainly medical professionals out there who value that insight that evolutionary theory can give in understanding humans.
And maybe in our last minute or so, you can address the last fallacy I want to bring up. And you've talked about this once before, but that species, evolution doesn't say species are designed in a ladder form, getting better and better as we progress, and that humans are right there underneath the angels.
Yeah.
But that's how a lot of people conceptualize
the great chain of being, one of the worst things we can do.
And you can tie that into maybe social Darwinism and Spencer, how he misunderstood it. And
all in 1 minute, you want to do this. Okay, here we go. Well, first of all, the whole great chain of being is really a bad thing. And anytime I see those pictures of evolution where they show a human at one end and a little tiny shrew at the other, I kind of cringe, because every species that exists today is just as successful as we are. They fit into their niche just as we fit into our niche. There is no great chain of being. It is in fact, it undermines the whole concept of evolutionary theory, and it gives religion a voice stronger than they should have. How's that?
That was perfect. All right. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time, Road to Reason.